right, hello. Thank you everyone who's made it today. Today, this is Cuyahoga Arts and Culture hosting a 990 Easy webinar with Plant Moran. Before we get started today, I did want to take a second and briefly introduce our team today. You can see here that we have Jill, our Executive Director, Meg, our Director of Administration, Jake Sinatra, who is the Director of Grant Making, Laura Matteo is our communications manager, and I, Davon Nichols, am a grants manager here at CAC, along with Maya Curtis. Before we dive into the 990 webinar, I would like to acknowledge that the land that we stand on and the place that we call Cuyahoga County is land that is claimed by the United States government through force, displacement, and treaties negotiated in bad faith. We acknowledge those of the Shawnee, Miami, Erie, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Haudenosaunee Confederacy whose lands we stand on, and the thousands of Native Americans representing over 100 tribes who currently live in Northeast Ohio today. We thank the Lake Erie Native American Council for helping us develop this acknowledgement. We also want to take a moment to share that CAC values equity. We choose to lead with racial equity work and our work because the creation and perpetuation of racial inequalities is embedded into our government and grant making. We confront the white supremacy that resides in our work because racial inequities across all indicators of success are deep and pervasive. We also acknowledge and recognize the power and potential that organizations who produce arts and cultural programming have. These are considered bearers of culture, and these institutions have the power to write the narrative about who belongs and who is valued. We encourage our organizations to connect with resources to advance equity in your work. Please visit cacgrants.org/equity or contact one of the grants managers to learn more. So for our 990 webinar today, this is in correlation with our open application season that we have right now for General Operating Support and Project Support 2026. The grant opportunities provided by CAC require financial documentation to be considered for funding. General Operating Support and Project Support are accepting applications this year, and they both accept organizations who file IRS Form 990EZ, which is what we will focus on today with our host from Plant Moran. However, it's important to note that the IRS form you file does matter to CAC. More explicitly, what your form or what you file will have a direct impact on the grant amount you may be eligible to receive with our grant programs. The correlation to how many 990s and fiscal years that will be requested at the application will vary based on your organization's budgets and financials. So it'd be best to review the grant guidelines to prepare you for the applications. You can always reach out to our grants manager to answer any specific questions, as things may vary based on the organizations. When looking for the grant applications, you can find your grant guidelines on our website at cacgrants.org/grants. We will post the link in the chat pretty soon, but you will also be able to receive it in a follow-up email after this webinar, which will include other links to various resources to assist with your application process. With that being said, I do want to take the time to invite our hosts from Plant Moran to introduce themselves. We're excited to have them here today, so just give me 1 second to come on the screen. Today we have here Michaela Leach, Maggie Matthews, and Mara Haney, and they will be conducting the latter of the 990 webinar. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to leave them in the chat. If I can't get them answered immediately, we will be sure to follow up with you guys soon after the webinar. With that being said, I'd like to welcome Maggie, Michaela, and Mara.
Thanks, Devon. I know Michaela will get this up and running. Yep, All right. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for having us today. So we'll be giving just an overview of the 990 Easy today, going over the forms and things to look out for, some schedules, and then we'll answer any questions you have. So a little background on each of us. I'm Maggie Matthews. I'm a tax manager here at Plant Moran. I think this is my third or maybe third time doing this presentation. I think I started when I was just a staff too, maybe four. Time is going by fast, but so I'm excited to be here. I've been at Plant Moran for about 6 years now, in the Columbus office specifically, and I work mostly with nonprofit organizations, specifically in healthcare and higher ed. But I've got a smattering of other types of organizations.
Awesome. Thanks, Maggie. Hi, everyone. I am Michaela. I am a tax staff also in the Columbus office, and I've been with Plant Moran for about 2 years now. This is my second year doing this presentation, so excited to be back for a second time with Maggie. I primarily also work in like nonprofit healthcare type industries, but also do a little bit in real estate and also manufacturing and distribution.
Hi, I'm Mara Haney, and I'm also in the Columbus office. I've been at Plant Moran for about 2 years, and I mainly do nonprofit work with also just a few other things here and there. Awesome. So I'm just going to go over a few like key reminders about the forms. A lot of this applies to the 990 and 990 Easy, but I know most of you are filing the Easy. So the IRS is now requiring electronic filing for these forms. They have for the past few years. So this link, I know the presentation will be sent out later, and these links should be accessible, but this will kind of list off the e-file providers that the IRS has approved. So if you're not filing or have the software to do it on your own, these are their approved ones. I'm sure you guys already have some form of filing system, but just making sure you're electronically filing and you're keeping that proof of acceptance. The failure to file penalties can rack up, and especially now as the IRS workforce is being kind of diminished, there are kind of less and less people to help you out with notices. I just wanted to I didn't have this listed here, but I think that's been a lot of the talk of the IRS workforce. So I just wanted to mention that they are kind of automating notices a lot of times. So if you are getting a notice and you're not really sure why you're getting it, or you did file and it's kind of telling you didn't, go ahead and try to reach out to the IRS. We're seeing this kind of more and more lately, and it's worth kind of trying to get a hold of them, give them a call, respond to the notice as quickly as possible to try to get it corrected. It may take a few tries, especially with kind of less people there manning the phones, and but I didn't put that on the slide, but just kind of as that's progressed these past few months, just wanted to throw that out there as you might be seeing more notices come up, and just to make sure to be responding to them. And then just a few other key reminders. So the EZ is an annual filing. So it's due the 5th month of the 15th day after your year end. So a lot of times if you're a calendar year, you're ending December 31st, it'll be due then May 15th. A lot of the other year filings, so 6/30 year end, if you're ending on June 30th, that's another common one. It'll be due November 15th. There are extensions to file, so you'll fill out a 8868, so that will need to be filled out by your original due date, and it will give you an additional 6 months. So say you're due May 15th, you extend, it's now November 15th is when the final filing is due for that year. And for the EZ, that gross income is no more than 50 or more than 50,000, but less than 200,000. So your gross receipts and your total assets can be no more than 500,000. So if you're in this range, you're good with the easy. But if you are going over that, that's going to trigger the full Form 990, which is a little bit more involved. And also, if your gross receipts kind of fall under that 50,000, you might be, or you'll be eligible for that 990N. And then with your state requirements, just kind of a reminder, ensure you check with your state that you're kind of up to date, you're registered. While your tax exemption is given to you federally, there are some state requirements for kind of charitable contributions. And for Ohio, it's really the Ohio Attorney General filing that's due every year. Same due dates as your federal form. So just checking with the registration, making sure you're registered, you're up to date on your submissions of filings. And then another reminder that the 990 is publicly disclosed. So anyone can go ahead and pull that form from the IRS website or kind of search on just like GuideStar is a big one. So we want to refrain from including any personal information, so Social Security, but other things like compensation is going to be made public. I think Mara touches on it later, but just a reminder that Schedule B for your contributions, that is the only thing excluded from public inspection. So when you pull that from the IRS website, that will be removed from the filing. But everything else is publicly disclosed. So just make sure that you're thinking about your readers and who can pull and look at your returns. All right, and then just a few more. Try to keep your records for a minimum of 3 years from when you filed. It's kind of having that documentation, again, just in case. Some of these notices from the IRS are a little delayed. So having records of when you'd file your acceptances, things like that are really important to have. And then making sure you're rounding to whole dollars on these returns and schedules. They do not like cents on the return. So just rounding up on kind of any dollar amount that you have on the return, and then making sure you're completing all the lines. So instead of having a blank, make sure you put a 0 if it's not applicable, or if it's a question that is answered no, instead of leaving it blank, make sure you're putting no, things like that. Just to ensure that your return is being processed as fully complete. If you're missing some of these lines, IRS could mark it as kind of an incomplete form. We don't see it often, but it's one of those things that it's an easy thing to do that could save you some time in the future. And then here's just a brief overview of the schedules that could apply. Again, not all of these will apply to your organization. Michaela will touch on kind of a supplemental schedule where it's answering these questions. We will highlight, though, the most frequent schedules that we see. Mara will touch base on those, but it's all based on kind of questions in the form that you'll answer that might trigger these schedules. And I think we had a question before I pass it off. So I know, Paul, you said what's a good nonprofit accounting software that's easily transferable? So this one's hard. So we personally use CCH Access, but again, for small organizations, it might not be the best software since we're on a larger scale. But I know I would check out the IRS's e-file providers, or if like the accounting software, you're talking more like QuickBooks. I know a lot of our clients use QuickBooks as kind of tracking. If you're talking more on that accounting software, and that usually can be easily pulled, you can pull basically your financial information pretty easily. But yeah. All right, I will pass it off to Michaela to kind of walk through the form itself.
All right, thanks, Maggie. So yeah, we're gonna hop in. We're gonna kind of talk about the core form, the 990EZ. Before we really dive too deep, I do want to point out that while you do see the 2022 in the screenshots and snips that we included in the slides, the form hasn't changed. So everything that you see here is still relevant. The only thing that's going to be updated is the date. So just pretend it's 2024. So starting on page 1, here at the top, this is kind of just going to be like your information that you need so that they know who's filing it. So you're going to have your name of your organization, your EIN, your address, phone number, website, all things like that. Also on line A, if you aren't a calendar year filer, just make sure you enter the dates of your fiscal year there as well. Down kind of in the second box on line J, you're going to want to put in your tax exempt status. It's likely going to be a 501c3, but if it's not, you can use the fill in the blank there as a 501c blank and just fill in whatever section you are. And then also on line K, you're going to want to put in your form of your organization. Again, we typically see corporation, but if you have something else, there are a couple other boxes and also another line where you can enter whatever you are. So that's going to be like your main form. Just make sure, like Maggie said, you're filling everything out. Like I said, telephone number, you're going to want to have, if there's anything that's applicable over on the left in box B, like your address change, your name change, or anything like that, just make sure you fill all that out so you don't get those notices. So as we move on, we're going to stay on page 1. This is part 1. This is going to be where all of your revenues and expenses, and then also your change in net assets are going to be listed. So starting at the top, it's going to be your revenue. These include things like contributions, if you have any income from fundraising events, investment income, if you have anything that's invested where you receive dividends or interest. Those are just a few examples of what might be included in your revenue. But as you can see, there's plenty of lines where you can add things and also another revenue line if there's something that doesn't fit in another category that you can use. Moving down the page, we have the expenses. So these are going to be things like if you give out any grants, if you pay anyone with salaries, if you have maintenance, maybe some rent, that's all going to be included in your expenses line. Again, you can see there are quite a few, as well as another expense if you have something that doesn't necessarily fit in one of the other boxes. And then at the very bottom, these are going to be where your net assets tie out. So you'll have your beginning net assets, which is your net assets from the previous year. You're going to add your revenue, subtract your expenses, and then if you have any other miscellaneous changes there. And then at the bottom on line 21, that's going to be your net assets for the end of the year. And we'll remember that line because we're going to talk about it on the next page. So continuing on to page 2, we have our balance sheet. This is where your assets, liabilities, and then your net assets are all going to be reported again. So your assets, you can see are like your cash, your savings, if you have any land or buildings, vehicles, equipment, things like that. And then assets, which will go on Schedule O if you have anything else that isn't reported in those 2 top lines. Then you're also going to have your liabilities on line 26. And then at the bottom on line 27, this is where your net assets are going to be. So if you remember when I said we're going to remember line 21 from the previous page, that's because we want line 21 from page 1 to tie to line 27 on page 2. So make sure those are tying out. So again, you don't get any notices from the IRS. So continuing on to page 2, this is sort of where we get into the bulk of you getting to explain what your organization is. So these are going to be your program service accomplishments. As you can see here, you have 3 spaces to kind of list out your top 3 or up to 3 program service accomplishments that you had. This is where you really get to dive deep and explain to people and explain what you're doing. You get to brag about yourself and all the good things that you do. And this is what people will look at to find what your organization does. So make sure you're telling your story as best you can while being clear and concise. So anything that you add here, if it goes over, it'll be listed on Schedule O, but just make sure that you're really telling your story and just really get to brag about yourself here. If you, sorry, over here on the right, you're going to see a spot for expenses. When you have expenses, you want to try to break them out as best you can based on your program service accomplishment. So if you have 3 different ones, just do the best you can to break it out between 28A, 29A, and 30A based on what those program service accomplishments are. And then also, if you give out any grants, you'll kind of see there on the left of each of the places where you can explain there's a little spot for grants. Again, just try to break them out as best you can between your different accomplishments. And that should also tie back to your page for expenses of grants. So just make sure that's another good thing to double check when you're trying to tie things out. So also on page 2, so you can see that there's a lot on page 2 here. This is going to be where you're going to list all of your officers, directors, trustees, and key employees, as well as your compensation. I would say that this is one of the more looked at areas of the return, just because compensation can be something that is easily discussed and viewed. So you're going to want to make sure it is as accurate as possible. So in column A, you're going to want to list the name and the title of all the people that you're reporting on this section. You're going to report officers, which are going to be like your CEO, a president, an elected member. You'll want to report directors, which are typically people who have voting rights, and then also key employees. So any employee who's really influential in like keeping the business running and they make more than $150,000, that's another person that you're going to want to add. So then you're also going to want to list the average hours per week that they devote to the position. So that might be like 40 hours a week if it's their full job, or if it's not, you'll want to just make sure you report that as well. As we keep moving towards the right, you're going to see there's 3 more columns. This is where you're going to list the compensation. So in column C, this is going to be your reportable compensation from your W-2, or if you give out like a 1099 miscellaneous form, 1099 non-employee compensation, anything there, that's going to be reported in column C. In column D, you're going to have your health benefits or any deferred compensation that they receive throughout the year. And then in column E, if they receive any other compensation that isn't included in column C or D, you'll want to go ahead and include it in column E. So this section can also be a little confusing because of the way you have to report. So the first thing to keep in mind is you're going to want to report any person who served on the board during your fiscal year. So for example, if you have a June 30th of 2024 fiscal year, you want to report anyone who received compensate or who served on the board between July 1st, 2023 and June 30th, 2024. And the thing that gets confusing is that you want to report your compensation on a calendar year end. So using that same example, if you have a June 30th, 2024 year end, you're going to want to use 2023 calendar year compensation. So I know that can be a little confusing. So we have a few extra slides throughout here that have just some tips and other more information that you can use to like know who you're supposed to report and how you're supposed to report them. So I'm not going to go through and read all of these because you can go back and read them when the slides are sent out. But just for your information, there's a few extra things here. So this one, like I said, it gives the example of the June 30th year end and when you should report the people and the compensation that you should report. This slide just goes through compensation reporting. So it kind of talks about what reportable compensation is. This one talks about the deferred compensation and some health benefits that wouldn't be included in column D. And this one talks about taxable versus and non-taxable fringe benefits that should also be included. So like I said, you can go back and look at these slides as a reference as you are completing your Form 990EZ. So now that we have finished page 2, we're going to go ahead and move on to page 3. We're not going to talk about every single question on there, but the biggest tip is just to go through and read all of the questions that are included on this page and making sure, again, reiterating what Maggie said, just make sure you fill it out as best you can. So if it's a question that you answer no, make sure you're actually answering it no and not just leaving it blank. And if it's an if or a skip question, you can skip those if they aren't relevant, but just make sure you're reading all the way through. If you read a question or you read a line and you're not 100% sure what it means, go back and reference the 990EZ instructions. You can find these just by a quick Google search. And they sometimes give a much better explanation that can help you determine whether you should answer the question yes or no. So we do want to highlight a few big questions that we see a lot that could trigger a few different things on page 3. So first, on lines 33 and 34, If you had any significant changes or you expanded your services beyond your core mission, you want to make sure you're reading these questions and providing an explanation on Schedule O if necessary. Also on line 35A, if you had any revenues that were unrelated to your charitable purpose, so this is called unrelated business income, you're going to want to make sure you disclose this and you explain what is going on. So for example, an unrelated business income, if you have a rental that doesn't relate to your purpose. So let's say you run a theater company and you're renting out a space for an ice cream shop. That obviously doesn't relate to what you're doing. So that would be considered unrelated business income. You're mainly looking for $1,000 or more. So if you're under that threshold, you should be fine, but just make sure you're taking a look at that.
And I just wanted to chime in on the unrelated business. This is one where the IRS likes to look at it. So it's just important here to have kind of documentation of your analysis of your revenue. So if you're getting revenue streams that are like a rental is the biggest one, like Michaela mentioned, that isn't explicitly kind of pulling back to your mission, just to have record of you kind of audited and analyzed it yourself and deemed it unrelated, or having kind of that argument of why it is related is important. So just making sure you're taking a look at the kind of those miscellaneous revenues. And there are a lot of rules, like we could do a whole other presentation on unrelated, but there are a lot of rules that go into it. But it's just one of the things, just keep an eye out on kind of those miscellaneous revenues, going over this threshold and having kind of documentation of kind of those activities and how they relate back.
Thanks, Maggie. So as we continue on, lines 44A and 45A, these relate to a donor advised fund. So before you start this form, if you have a donor advised fund, no, you have to use the regular form 990. And then if you control another entity, just make sure you're reading through these questions because you could potentially do a full form 990. So you don't want to get through all the way the easy, realize you have to do a 990 and then almost start from scratch and have to do the 990. So just wanted to point these out so you can make sure you take a look at these before you start filling out all the information. And then lastly, for the highlights that we wanted to point out, we want to be careful with the political support and lobbying. So you'll want to look at questions 46 and 47. And if you did have political support or did any sort of lobbying during your fiscal year, it's gonna trigger a Schedule C. So that's an additional schedule that you'll have to fill out based on your response to these two questions. And then lastly, on page 4, this is sort of the last thing that you do. This is where you're going to have your person sign the return. So this can be anyone that has board approval or is in the docs that are allowed, as in like an authorized signer at the date the return is filed. So a couple examples you can see here on the slide. This can be like your president, your vice president, a treasurer, or really, like I said, anyone who's authorized to sign the tax return. And then if you did have a preparer, that information would be filled out at the bottom. But if not, that can just be left blank. So that is the core form of the 990EZ. So now I'm going to hand it off to Mara, who's going to talk about a couple of the additional schedules.
Thanks, Michaela. So like Maggie mentioned earlier, there are a bunch of different types of schedules, but we're just going to be going over 4 of the most common that we see. So first is Schedule A, which is going to define your public charity status, and this should also be reflected in your determination letter as to what type you are. And then depending on the type of status you have, that might trigger additional public support calculations. And an example of this would be the 33 1/3 support test, which just shows that your public support is over 33 1/3% of your total revenue. And those revenues should also be reflected on Part 1 of the 990EZ as well. And then next, Schedule B. Just a listing of your contributors and donors. And like Maggie mentioned earlier, the names and addresses will not be publicly available. That's just for internal use, but the amounts will be made publicly available. And then the only ones that are needed for the face of Schedule B is contributions over $5,000. And then if there's an anonymous donor, that's fine. We just they'll just be needed documentation for the fact that it's actually an anonymous donor, and then the organization's address will just need to be used for that donor. And then the total on Schedule B should not exceed the total of contributions on Part 1, Line 1 of the 990 EZ. And then
just to chime in, so with the $5,000 in contributions, that's going to be aggregate. So it's not, so over the course of the year, if the total contributed is $5,000, that needs to be reported. So if they gave $1,000 for 5 months, that will trigger them to be listed here, even though each individual contribution wasn't over 5,000. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. And then Schedule G is for fundraising, specifically events that earned over $15,000 in revenue, which is both gross revenue and contributions combined. But they will also need to be split out for the form. So an example that we have on the screen to show the difference between the two. So if you have a ticket for a golfing event or any other fundraiser is $50, but then the actual cost or fair value of the actual event to golf or to have a meal at a gala is $30. The gross receipt is the actual cost to do said event. And then the contribution is the difference between the actual cost and the ticket to do the event. And then the contribution should also be reflected on the letters to the donors as well. And then lastly, we have Schedule O, which is the narratives. So anything that won't fit in previous spaces. So if you really want to brag about your charitable impact, mission statements, anything like that, and if they don't fit in those boxes, they can flow over to Schedule O, but this part will be made publicly available, so just keep that in mind. And then any additional disclosures that are like needed or wanted to show additional detail for financials or any information about grants received from outside sources, anything like that can go here, or anything that doesn't feel like it fits anywhere else can go here. And then any significant changes in activities also will be detailed here as well. And then that's the schedules. So I'll hand it back to Maggie.
Thank you. And I see, Paula, your question about contributions. So if they're like non-cash contributions, those should be reported on Schedule B. The in-kinds, so that if they're over the threshold, well, actually, no, they won't be reported. So if it's donated service or hours, those don't need to be reported on Schedule B. But gifts of property, so let's say stock, I've seen artwork, things like that. Those will be on Schedule B, but that kind of donated hours or service isn't necessarily reported. Those should, though, be on, I think there should be a line. Actually, no, that'll be on the full form. So yeah, on the EZ, those don't need to be specified, but and then these are some links that can help out, give some more guidance. Most of them are IRS guidances of tools and resources for filing. Again, the instructions are a fantastic resource. I know I look at the 990 instructions, I feel like every day. That has a lot of information in there. It can take some rethink or some thinking through of the wording, but it's very helpful. And then the Charitable Ohio link there, that's going to be, if you're registered in Ohio, that's where you'll do your annual filing. Also can check your registration, things like that. Yeah. And then here's our contact information. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to either any of us, and we can kind of answer them or point you in the right direction. We're happy to help out with any questions. And yeah, I think if you have any further questions, feel free to throw them out now. But if not, thank you for having us today.
you so much, guys, for hosting with us. Um, right now in the chat, I am going to just drop a couple of links of some items that came up today. So I have the link to our guidelines. I have another link for TechSoup. There was a question asking about resources. TechSoup is an organization that provides some discounts for things like QuickBooks and other services. And I also grabbed a link for the e-file provider services that were mentioned in response to that first question. So we will go ahead and be sure to we will make sure that all of the links embedded in the presentation will be extracted so you guys will be able to access them and you guys can anticipate seeing that follow-up email before the week is out. But that is all that we have for you today. If you have any questions, you can reach out to either of the grant managers. We'll be sure to get your questions answered. And I just want to give another thank you to Maggie, Michaela, and Marla for having this time with us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.